Sometimes, people judge too quickly, thinking wealth and privilege define intelligence. But this story flips that belief on its head. It begins with a young black girl, confident, brilliant, and fluent in 6 languages, who walks into a room full of powerful businessmen. Among them sits a smug millionaire who sees only her skin and her youth, not her skill. When she proudly says, "I speak 6 languages," laughter fills the air. But moments later, that laughter dies, replaced by silence and awe, because what she does next doesn't just prove her worth. It changes the course of an entire global deal, leaving everyone, especially the millionaire, speechless. The room buzzed with the low hum of polite conversation, the kind of energy that fills the air before an important meeting begins. Expensive suits brushed past each other, gold watches gleamed under the soft lighting, and the scent of imported cologne hung in the atmosphere like an invisible signature of wealth. At the far end of the table sat a man everyone knew, Richard Belmont, a self-made millionaire whose reputation for arrogance was as vast as his fortune. His laugh, sharp and condescending, often filled boardrooms where he believed only people of his caliber belonged. Today, he was particularly amused. Across from him sat a young black girl named Amara, barely in her 20s, her posture straight, her eyes clear and calm. She wore a simple navy blazer that contrasted sharply with the tailored extravagance surrounding her. She was there as an interpreter, or so he thought. But to him, she looked out of place. Too young, too modestly dressed, too soft-spoken to matter in a room of sharks. When introductions began, everyone spoke about years of experience, their global ventures, and the millions they'd turned into billions. When it was Amara's turn, her introduction was brief but striking. "I speak 6 languages," she said simply, her tone even and unshaken. The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Richard chuckled, not kindly, but dismissively. It was the laugh of a man who had already decided her value before she even opened her mouth. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with amusement, as if her statement was a punchline to a joke only he understood. 6 languages, he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "That's quite a claim. Maybe you should try mastering English first before collecting the rest." The table filled with restrained laughter from those eager to stay in his favor, their chuckles echoing in awkward harmony. Amara didn't flinch. Her gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. Inside, she was used to it. The quiet underestimation, the casual prejudice disguised as humor, the way people like Richard believed confidence in a black woman was arrogance, and intelligence was rare. She had faced this all her life, in classrooms, job interviews, even in casual conversations where people assumed she was exaggerating her skills. What Richard didn't know was that every laugh, every doubt, every eye that rolled when she spoke had sharpened her resolve like steel being forged in fire. Richard turned to the others, still grinning. "You see, this is the problem with today's youth," he said, gesturing toward Amara. "They think confidence is the same as competence. 6 languages. Next, she'll tell us she's a financial strategist too." His words were met with polite smirks and nods, the kind of response people give when they're too cowardly to disagree. But not everyone laughed. A few faces around the table showed discomfort. They recognized the tone of superiority that Richard often wielded as a weapon. Still, no one spoke up. It was easier to let the powerful man have his moment. Amara's eyes flickered briefly toward him, not with anger but with something else. Quiet power. She didn't need to prove anything. Not yet. But she remembered that tone. It was the same tone her university professor used when he told her she'd never thrive in international business because she didn't fit the image clients expected. It was the same tone a recruiter used when he praised her impressive resume, but questioned whether she'd be comfortable working in elite circles. And now, here it was again, in a high-rise boardroom, from a man who had no idea that she had already negotiated contracts in languages he couldn't even pronounce. The meeting began, and while everyone opened their laptops and flipped through documents, Richard kept glancing at her with a smirk that said he was waiting for her to stumble. He couldn't fathom that someone so young, so different from his idea of success, could possibly add value to the conversation. He whispered something to the man beside him. Another chuckle followed, but Amara ignored it. Her mind was already processing the material in front of her, analyzing the key terms in English, Mandarin, and French simultaneously. Words were her world, and understanding them came as naturally to her as breathing. When the discussion turned to potential investors from Europe and Asia, Richard dominated the conversation, throwing around figures and projections, certain that his charisma and money would win over anyone. He spoke with the kind of loud confidence that fills space, leaving no room for others to interrupt. But when one of the foreign representatives on the video call began speaking in rapid Mandarin, Richard's confident expression faltered. He turned toward his assistant, who fumbled to find the interpreter notes. Before anyone could react, Amara spoke fluently, naturally, as though she'd been part of that culture all her life. Her tone was respectful, her translation precise. The foreign delegates smiled with relief, responding warmly to her. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly tried to reclaim his composure. "Well, looks like our translator's earning her seat today," he said, his voice tinged with sarcasm. trying to downplay the moment. But inside, something in him stirred, a small, uneasy recognition that perhaps he had misjudged her. Amara didn't look at him. She continued her work with quiet efficiency, her voice carrying across the room like a calm river cutting through noise. Still, Richard's arrogance wouldn't let him stop. 6 languages, huh? He said later, during a brief pause, pretending to sound curious. Mind giving us a demonstration? Maybe say something in all of them. Impress the room. The others chuckled, thinking it was a harmless challenge, but they missed the edge in his tone. He wasn't curious. He was testing her, expecting her to falter. Amara looked up, her eyes steady and unbuttoned. Without hesitation, she began speaking first in French, her accent flawless and fluid, then in Spanish, melodic and confident, then in Mandarin, the tonal precision crisp and natural. From there, she switched to Arabic, then German, and finally Japanese. Each language rolling off her tongue like poetry. The room fell silent. Even the background noise from the hallway seemed to fade. Every face turned toward her, eyes widening as realization sank in. When she stopped, she looked directly at Richard. There was no pride in her expression, no smugness, only calm assurance, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Richard's smirk had vanished completely. His fingers fidgeted on the table, his earlier laughter now echoing in his mind as something hollow and foolish. He had spent a lifetime equating wealth with wisdom, and yet in that moment he understood that true intelligence speaks in ways money never can. The air in the room shifted, heavy with the weight of unspoken acknowledgement, and for the first time, Richard found himself without a witty remark, realizing that the very person he had mocked might just be the most capable one in the entire room. As the meeting moved deeper into the negotiation phase, the energy in the room began to shift. The initial laughter and small talk faded into a tense focus on the high-stakes deal being discussed. The project on the table wasn't just another transaction, it involved multiple international corporations, each bringing their own languages, legal frameworks, and cultural nuances into the mix. For most people, this kind of environment would be overwhelming. For Amara, it was a stage she had silently prepared for her entire life. She understood not just the words people spoke, but the layers beneath them, the tone, the rhythm, the subtle inflections that revealed meaning far beyond translation. This was where her true power began to show. Even if no one else in the room realized it yet, the foreign investors, particularly those from Japan and Germany, had joined via live conference, their representatives speaking in their native tongues as they reviewed clauses and pricing terms. The hired interpreters, though skilled, began to struggle with the complex terminology and fast-paced exchanges. Amara listened quietly at first, her eyes flicking between the faces on the screen and the pages of the contract in front of her. Every time a sentence was mistranslated or a phrase twisted into the wrong meaning, she winced internally. She knew that even a small error could derail the delicate trust being built in the room. Richard, of course, remained oblivious. He had no patience for linguistic details, as he put it. "We all speak the language of business," he said with a smirk, tapping his pen on the table. But Amara knew better. Business might be universal, but respect was not. The tone one used with a Japanese executive, the phrasing one chose for a German partner, these things mattered. They could mean the difference between sealing a deal and losing credibility. As the confusion mounted, one of the investors spoke sharply in Mandarin, clearly dissatisfied. The interpreter hesitated, stumbling through the translation. Richard frowned, irritated not by the problem itself, but by the delay it caused. "Can we get this moving?" he snapped, glancing at the team. Amara exhaled softly and leaned forward. Her voice was calm, confident, and perfectly fluent as she addressed the speaker directly in Mandarin, clarifying the misunderstanding with professional precision. She apologized gracefully on behalf of the team, explaining the intended meaning of the clause in their contract. The investor's expression softened immediately, their tone shifting from defensive to collaborative. For a moment, silence filled the room. Richard's pen froze mid. He looked at her, surprised again, though he tried to mask it behind a thin smile. Amara didn't look at him. She was too focused on maintaining the momentum of the conversation, seamlessly transitioning from Mandarin to English to summarize for the rest of the board. The Japanese representatives then raised a concern about product compliance standards in Asia. Before the interpreter could even react, Amara switched languages again, addressing them in polite, formal Japanese, acknowledging their point and offering a suggestion that balanced both sides' needs. Her tone was respectful, yet assertive, the kind of delivery that commanded attention without aggression. Gradually, the dynamics of the room began to change. The investors, who had initially appeared hesitant and skeptical, now leaned forward, engaging more directly with her. They spoke to her, not to Richard. They trusted her to understand them, and she did, not just linguistically, but emotionally. She grasped the intentions behind their words, the cultural diplomacy hidden in their phrasing. What had started as a meeting dominated by ego was quietly transforming into one led by intellect and empathy. As the dialogue unfolded, Amara began making notes directly on the contract draft. She corrected translation errors, clarified legal terminology, and even adjusted phrasing to suit the tone of each audience. Her pen moved quickly but thoughtfully, capturing nuances that could take others hours to interpret. One of the German delegates commented, through their translator, that her precision was remarkably sophisticated. Amara smiled and responded to him in flawless German, her accent so authentic it made the interpreter pause mid. The delegate's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded in appreciation. Richard, sitting beside her, felt his confidence waver for the first time that morning. He had walked into this meeting assuming his money and influence would command respect. But now it was this young woman, the one he had mocked earlier, who held the room together. The investors deferred to her judgment. They listened when she spoke. Even his own team began to direct their questions toward her instead of him. It was as if the balance of authority had silently shifted, and no one had to announce it. Throughout the discussion, Amara demonstrated a kind of fluency that went far beyond words. When one delegate used a proverb to explain their company's philosophy, she didn't just translate it literally, she conveyed its essence, rephrasing it into something that resonated across cultures. When humor was used to lighten the tension, she joined in with subtle, contextually appropriate wit, earning smiles from both sides. Her understanding wasn't mechanical, it was human, deeply intuitive. She bridged not just language gaps, but emotional distances, creating a sense of connection in a room where miscommunication could have easily led to mistrust. The moment that truly captured everyone's attention came when a sudden disagreement arose. Between two delegations over pricing terms, voices grew tense, and the interpreters began scrambling to keep up. Richard shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his assistant for solutions. But Amara stood before anyone could intervene. She spoke first in English, summarizing each side's perspective with perfect clarity, then addressed one party in French and the other in Mandarin, mediating their points of contention, so each side felt heard. Her delivery was composed and diplomatic, her logic sound. Within minutes, the tension dissolved, replaced by nods of understanding and reluctant smiles. The entire boardroom sat in stunned silence for a moment after she finished. No one had expected the quiet girl at the edge of the table to take control of an international dispute with such authority. The investors exchanged glances, visibly impressed. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but for once, no words came out. His usual arrogance had been replaced by a dawning realization. This young woman wasn't just an interpreter or a linguistic prodigy. She was a strategist, a negotiator, someone who saw the whole picture while others got lost in the details. By the time the meeting neared its midpoint, it was clear to everyone that Amara wasn't just participating, she was leading. The foreign investors began directing their questions exclusively to her. They asked for her opinion on adjustments, her advice on regional compliance, even her take on cultural considerations that might affect market entry. Each time, she responded with articulate confidence, drawing on her deep understanding of both language and business. Every sentence she spoke carried authority, and every solution she offered brought the team closer to agreement. Richard watched quietly, his earlier laughter now a distant memory. He tried to reclaim his influence a few times, interrupting with remarks or summaries, but each attempt only made it clearer how little he actually understood the complexities at play. Amara, on the other hand, never once raised her voice or demanded recognition. Her power came from competence, not ego. And as the hours passed, it became undeniable. The person holding the meeting together wasn't the millionaire who thought he owned the room, but the woman he had laughed at just moments before. By the time the meeting reached its final stretch, the tension that had once hung in the air was replaced by something entirely different: admiration. The investors, once cautious and skeptical, now leaned forward with genuine interest, their eyes fixed on Amara. Every time she spoke, her words carried weight. She had turned a chaotic, fragmented discussion into a coherent, forward-moving negotiation. But the real turning point, the moment that would echo far beyond this glass-walled boardroom, was yet to come. The deal they were working on, a multi-million-dollar global partnership, had stalled for weeks. Due to communication barriers and cultural misunderstandings, several parties were on the verge of walking away, and even Richard, with all his arrogance and money, had been unable to salvage it. That was when Amara, armed only with her intellect and the power of her words, decided to take control completely. As the meeting resumed after a short break, the international representatives began to discuss the final sticking points: distribution rights and profit shares. The conversation quickly grew complex, with multiple languages bouncing around the room: English, French, Mandarin, and German blending into a confusing hum. The interpreters struggled to keep pace, the rhythm of translation breaking apart under the pressure. Amara listened quietly at first, her pen poised above her notebook, her eyes darting between the documents and the speakers. Then, with a calm confidence that silenced even the background chatter, she stood up. "If I may," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I think I can help clarify this so we all understand one another." The room went quiet. Richard raised an eyebrow, his mouth slightly open as if to object. but something in her tone made him hesitate. Amara walked toward the screen displaying the video conference participants and, switching languages fluidly, began addressing each group directly. She started with the French representatives, summarizing their concerns with precise vocabulary and impeccable pronunciation, then transitioned into Mandarin to explain the same point to the Asian delegation, making sure to adjust her tone and phrasing to fit their formal business etiquette. From there, she shifted seamlessly to German, outlining the proposed adjustments in a way that honored their straightforward and detail-oriented communication style. Each delegation nodded in understanding. What had been a wall of confusion moments ago was now a bridge of mutual comprehension. She didn't just translate words. She translated meaning. She understood the unspoken, the cultural weight behind how each group perceived fairness, the values that shaped their expectations. When one delegate from Tokyo mentioned concerns about long-term trust, Amara didn't dismiss it as a formality. She responded with a proverb in Japanese that conveyed respect and assurance. A phrase that immediately softened the atmosphere. That small gesture, thoughtful and precise, carried more impact than any corporate promise Richard's team had made in months. As the conversation deepened, Amara began to guide the negotiations, balancing firmness with diplomacy. She suggested a revised structure for profit sharing, explaining in multiple languages how it would ensure equity while encouraging collaboration. Every time she switched languages, the room seemed to hold its breath. The transitions were flawless, her tone shifting naturally, authoritative in English, graceful in French, tactful in Mandarin. It wasn't just impressive, it was mesmerizing. People who had entered the meeting doubtful of her suddenly found themselves relying entirely on her judgment. Richard sat silently, watching her with a mix of disbelief and awe. The same girl he had mocked earlier was now commanding the room, not with arrogance, but with brilliance. He could feel the attention shifting entirely toward her, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one everyone listened to. It stung, but even he couldn't deny what he was witnessing. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was mastery. Then came the decisive moment, the final clause, the one issue that had kept all parties divided for months. The exclusivity term. Each delegation had their own interests to protect, and no one wanted to compromise. The discussion grew tense again, voices rising slightly, the harmony beginning to fracture. Amara listened carefully, her brow furrowing as she pieced together the underlying motivations of each side. She realized the problem wasn't greed, but fear. Each group was afraid of losing leverage, and that was something she could fix, not with force, but with understanding. She began to speak again. First in English to set the foundation, then shifting languages to address each concern individually. To the European investors, she spoke of transparency and shared governance. To the Asian delegates, she emphasized partnership and longevity, using culturally resonant terms that conveyed unity and honor. To the American representatives, she framed it as a strategic advantage, highlighting mutual growth. Each group nodded slowly, their expressions softening as they recognized themselves in her words. Then she presented a rewritten clause. Her own carefully worded solution that managed to preserve everyone's dignity and satisfy their core demands. The silence that followed was profound. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The delegates glanced at one another, reading the unspoken consensus in each other's faces. Finally, the lead representative from Japan spoke first, his tone warm and resolute. "We agree," he said simply. One by one, the others followed. France agreed. Germany agreed. The United States agreed. The deal, the one that months of corporate meetings, consultants, and million-dollar strategies couldn't finalize, was sealed in a single afternoon, orchestrated by a young woman who had been laughed at just hours earlier. The sound of polite applause filled the room, but beneath it was something deeper: respect. Genuine, unfiltered respect. The investors began thanking her directly, offering business cards, expressing admiration for her skill. "You made the impossible possible," one of them said. Another remarked, "Your command of language is extraordinary, but your understanding of people is even greater." Richard managed a tight smile, clapping slowly as he tried to compose himself. He had been in countless meetings, closed dozens of high-value deals, but none had unfolded like this. None had made him feel so small and humbled. When the investors logged off, the room slowly emptied, leaving only a few executives behind. Richard finally approached her, his tone quieter than before. "I underestimated you," he admitted, the words heavy with reluctant sincerity. Amara turned to him, her expression calm but not unkind. "You didn't underestimate me," she said softly. "You just never tried to see me." Her words weren't sharp, but they landed with the weight of truth. As she gathered her notes, the echoes of the meeting lingered. The signatures on that agreement would soon be celebrated in business headlines around the world, hailed as a breakthrough in global cooperation. What no one would see in those headlines was the story behind it. The story of a girl who had been doubted, laughed at, and dismissed, yet still stood tall enough to command the attention of nations. The global deal wasn't just a triumph of business. It was a triumph of quiet strength, intellect, and the power of belief in oneself. And as she walked out of that boardroom, leaving behind a millionaire who now saw the world differently. The sound of that earlier laughter seemed like a distant echo, swallowed by the undeniable truth of her success.